Okay, so Jeffrey Epstein, Steve Bannon, and now there's this reported leaked interview. And I'll be honest, when I first saw those two names in the same headline again, I didn't feel shock. I felt tension, like something in the room tightened up a little. Not because I knew what it meant, but because I knew what people were going to assume it meant. And that's where I want to start, because every time Epstein's name comes back into the conversation, it doesn't land like a normal news story. It lands like an unfinished chapter, like something that never fully closed. That whole case, whether you followed it closely or not, never gave people that clean, slow courtroom unraveling that explains everything step by step. It just stopped. And when stories stop instead of conclude, they linger. So when I hear there was an interview, especially involving someone like Steve Bannon, who is known for understanding media, messaging, narrative strategy, I understand why people immediately think, okay, what was going on there? But here's the thing. An interview is not a conspiracy. A recording is not a master plan. Two powerful people talking is not automatically evidence of coordination. And I think we've reached a point culturally where proximity feels like proof. Like if two names that carry weight show up together, that must mean something deeper is happening. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it's just two people talking. And that's the uncomfortable space. It's because we live in a time where trust is low. So when powerful names intersect, people don't assume randomness. They assume intention. Now let me step back. If someone has lived for years inside elite circles, finance, politics, academia, media, they get conditioned. They start thinking in terms of leverage, optics, positioning, damage control. So if someone facing public collapse believed they could still influence how their story was told, that's not shocking to me. That's human ego mixed with power conditioning. It doesn't make it right, it makes it predictable. And if you bring someone into the room who understands narrative strategy, of course people are going to see that as calculated. But here's where I slow myself down. Seeing something as calculated is not the same as proving that it was coordinated in some larger, hidden way. And I think that distinction is disappearing online because the media ecosystem we're in now rewards tension. It rewards implication. It rewards that feeling of, wait, this is bigger than it looks. Headlines are written for engagement. Commentary is optimized for reaction. Clips get cut to emphasize the most dramatic angle. And before you know it, the atmosphere around a story becomes heavier than the facts we actually have. And atmosphere is powerful. Atmosphere makes something feel explosive, even if the verified details are still limited. Now, does that mean there's nothing there? No, it means we don't know enough yet. And that's a very unsatisfying place to be, because people don't just want accountability. They want closure. They want that moment where everything gets laid out cleanly and you can say, okay, that's what happened. But this story never gave that. So every resurfaced detail feels like it might finally be the missing piece. And maybe it is, or maybe it's just another fragment in a story that was never going to end neatly. Here's what I do know. Powerful environments normalize strategic thinking. That's real. Media ecosystems amplify implication. That's real. Public distrust fills in blanks when context is missing. That's also real. All three of those forces are colliding here, and when they collide around a symbolically charged name like Epstein, the reaction is always going to be intense. But intensity is not evidence. Volume is not proof. And repetition is not confirmation. We have to separate what we feel from what we actually know. And right now, what we know is simple. An interview reportedly existed. It resurfaced. And the cultural climate made it feel explosive. Everything beyond that requires verification. And that's where I stay. Not dismissing it, not dramatizing it, just staying in that uncomfortable middle. Because in a system built on speed, Slowing down is almost rebellious, and I'd rather be slow and accurate than fast and wrong. So let's go a little deeper, because I think what's really sitting underneath this isn't the interview itself. It's what it represents psychologically. When someone spends years, maybe decades, inside elite spaces, they don't think the way the average person thinks about crisis. That's not an insult. It's conditioning. If you've operated in rooms where influence matters more than emotion, where outcomes shift based on messaging, where reputation can be buffered by the right connections, you start believing, consciously or not, that situations are navigable, even bad ones. So imagine you're someone whose name is collapsing publicly. Is it surprising that you might want to speak? That you might want to explain yourself? That you might believe you can frame the narrative in a way that softens impact? That's ego, yes, but it's also habit. Power builds habits. Habits of control, habits of repositioning, habits of believing you still have moves left on the board. Now, when people hear that an interview existed, especially with someone known for understanding narrative strategy, they don't just hear conversation, they hear maneuver. But here's where I check myself. Believing someone might attempt to manage their image is not the same thing as proving they coordinated something larger. Those are two different levels of claim. And culturally, we blur that difference all the time because suspicion feels smart. Suspicion makes you feel alert, like you're not being naive, like you're seeing through something. But suspicion without restraint turns into assumption. And assumption spreads fast, especially in an environment where trust is already low. Now think about this. Elite environments are dense. People who seem worlds apart publicly often share overlapping circles privately. Conferences, advisory boards, fundraisers, media projects, strategy sessions, think tanks. From the inside, that's networking. From the outside, that's secrecy. And that gap is huge. Because when trust erodes, normal proximity starts to feel coordinated. So when you see two powerful names connected in any context, your brain jumps to why, not what was said, but what were they planning? And that jump says more about the climate than it does about the room. That doesn't mean nothing happened. It means we're interpreting through layers of distrust. And distrust changes scale. A simple conversation can feel systemic. A recorded interview can feel like a chess move. And the more symbolically loaded the names are, the heavier that interpretation becomes. This is why I keep coming back to discipline. We can acknowledge that powerful people try to shape narratives. That's not controversial. Politicians do it. CEOs do it. Public figures do it. That's part of operating at that level. But we cannot automatically escalate that into proof of deeper coordination without evidence. That leap might feel logical, but feeling logical and being verified are different things. And if we don't protect that distinction, we lose clarity. Now, here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. There's something unsettling about the idea that someone facing that level of scandal might still believe they had influence. It challenges our desire for finality. We want collapse to feel absolute. We want consequences to feel definitive. But power doesn't always evaporate instantly. Networks don't dissolve overnight. Reputation damage doesn't erase conditioning. And that's psychologically hard to accept because it means systems are stickier than we'd like. So when this interview resurfaces, it's not just about what might have been discussed. It's about being reminded that influence and insulation can linger. And that reminder creates tension. But tension is not proof, it's discomfort. And discomfort can either make you curious or make you jump to conclusions. I'm choosing curiosity, not passive curiosity, active, disciplined curiosity. What was actually said? What context are we missing? What are we projecting onto the situation because of how we feel about the larger story? Those questions matter more than dramatic assumptions. And until we have full context, everything beyond the existence of the interview is interpretation. And interpretation needs boundaries. Let's go into the machine around this. Because this isn't just about an interview. It's about what happens when Something like this hits the modern media ecosystem. And this is where things get louder than they need to be. Media today runs on attention. That's not cynical, it's structural. Attention is survival. If people don't click, watch, share, react, the platform loses oxygen. And what pulls attention? Tension. Not calm explanations, not let's wait for more context. Tension. So when two symbolically charged names show up together, Epstein and Bannon, you don't need dramatic new facts to generate reaction. The association itself is combustible. Headlines don't have to accuse, they just have to imply weight. Leaked. Resurfaced. Secret interview. Those words don't declare guilt, they suggest depth. And suggestion spreads. Now here's what happens next. One outlet posts it, another comments on it, independent creators react to it. Clips get cut, threads get written, and every layer adds tone. Tone is powerful. If the tone feels dramatic, the audience interprets it as dramatic. If the tone feels suspicious, the audience assumes suspicion is justified, even if the underlying facts haven't expanded. Repetition then hardens perception. You see it once, it's interesting. You see it 5 times, it feels significant. You see it everywhere. It feels confirmed. But repetition is not proof. It's amplification. And amplification in a low trust climate is gasoline, because people are already primed to believe powerful individuals operate strategically behind closed doors. So when this story spreads, it doesn't start from neutral ground. It starts from suspicion. That's key. The ecosystem doesn't need to invent conspiracy. It just needs to place emotionally loaded names next to each other and let tone do the rest. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Suspicion performs better than nuance. This looks deeper than it seems, spreads faster than we don't yet have full context. Because depth feels exciting, caution feels boring. And in an attention economy, boring doesn't survive. And that doesn't mean the story is false. It means the velocity of reaction is often faster than the velocity of verification. And that gap creates distortion. By the time careful context arrives, if it arrives, people may already have formed conclusions based on atmosphere. And atmosphere is sticky. Now, layer something else in. Independent media and commentary ecosystems compete with traditional outlets. Competition increases intensity. The sharper the take, the more it stands out. So framing escalates. A cautious headline becomes a suggestive breakdown. A suggestive breakdown becomes a suspicious thread. A suspicious thread becomes a viral clip. And suddenly the tone of the entire story shifts, not because new evidence appeared, because the ecosystem rewarded sharper interpretation. That's the machine. Now think about what makes this specific case volatile. The Epstein story never felt complete. It exists in cultural memory as unresolved. So when anything adjacent resurfaces, people don't interpret it as isolated. They interpret it as part of a larger unfinished puzzle. And unfinished puzzles make every new piece feel massive, even if it's small. That's why this feels heavy, not necessarily because of what's confirmed, but because the climate amplifies association into implication, and implication into perceived significance. But here's the discipline again. Association is not confirmation. Implication is not evidence. Atmosphere is not proof. And if we don't actively separate those things, we confuse intensity with validity, which is exactly what the attention economy quietly trains us to do. We're not done. All right, let's go deeper. Because once you understand the media machine, the next layer is the human one, the network one. This is where elite psychology really comes in. People outside elite environments tend to imagine them as either secret conspiracies or total myths. The reality is more subtle and more complicated. Elite circles are dense. Finance overlaps with politics. Politics overlaps with media. Media overlaps with academia. Academia overlaps with tech. The same names rotate through conferences, boards, advisory panels, fundraisers, strategy meetings. That's not a theory. That's just how power ecosystems function. From the inside, that proximity feels normal. It feels like networking. It feels like opportunity. It feels transactional. From the outside, it feels opaque, and opacity breeds suspicion. So when you see two powerful names connected, even just through a conversation, your brain doesn't interpret it as random. It interprets it as layered. Because in a low-trust era, people assume access equals coordination. But proximity does not automatically equal alliance. It equals access, and access is common at high levels. Now, here's where it gets psychologically uncomfortable. Elite environments normalize strategic behavior. If you operate in rooms where messaging is discussed openly, where crisis response is mapped out, where narrative framing is part of everyday conversation, then talking strategy doesn't feel sinister internally. It feels procedural. If someone's reputation is collapsing and they speak to someone who understands media, that might internally feel like, let's talk about how this plays. Externally, it feels like, what are they planning? That gap is everything. Inside the network, procedural. Outside the network, conspiratorial. And when trust is thin, the outside interpretation dominates. Now, let's add another layer. Power environments create insulation. Legal teams, PR advisors, financial buffers, institutional connections. Insulation doesn't mean immunity, but it changes how crisis feels. If you've lived long enough inside insulation, collapse doesn't always feel final. It can feel transitional. Something to navigate rather than something that erases you instantly. That's hard for the public to accept because people want gravity to feel absolute. When someone falls, we want it to be definitive. But elite systems don't dissolve instantly. They dissolve slowly, and slow dissolution feels like maneuvering, even when it's just inertia. Now, here's the key point. Understanding that elite networks are dense and insulated does not automatically mean coordinated wrongdoing occurred. It means we have to distinguish between structural proximity and intentional conspiracy. That distinction requires discipline. Because emotionally, structural proximity feels like evidence. But structurally, dense environments produce frequent intersections without hidden agendas every single time. And this is where symbolic weight makes everything heavier. Epstein became symbolic, not just of crime, but of elite failure. So any connection, even procedural, even limited, carries amplified meaning. It's not just a name, it's a symbol touching another symbol. And symbol meets symbol feels systemic, even when the actual interaction might be smaller than the symbolism around it. And that's the tension. That's why this doesn't feel simple. It's not just about who talked to who. It's about what those names represent in public consciousness. And in a culture that doesn't fully trust elite systems, symbolic proximity feels like confirmation. But confirmation requires proof. All right, let's land this. And I want to land it honestly, not dramatically. Because here's the real thing that's happening underneath all of this. This story doesn't feel explosive because we have confirmed something massive. It feels explosive because of what it represents. Epstein represents unfinished business, a scandal that never fully played out in public in a way that satisfied people. No long courtroom unraveling, no full narrative arc that felt complete. It just ended abruptly. And when something that big ends without psychological closure, it stays alive in the background. So when an interview resurfaces in Brisbane, especially with someone associated with political narrative strategy, it doesn't land as random. It lands as potentially meaningful. But here's the discipline part. Potentially meaningful is not the same as proven significant. And culturally, we are struggling to hold that middle ground. Because we live in a time where distrust is high. When trust is low, ambiguity feels incriminating. Silence feels strategic. Proximity feels coordinated. Conversations feel like planning sessions. That's the climate. And media economics amplifies that climate. Elite networks reinforce that climate. Public memory of unfinished scandals fuels that climate, or all three collide here. But collision does not equal conspiracy. That's the key. It's completely fair to ask questions. It's completely fair to want context. It's completely fair to feel uneasy about how power environments operate. What isn't fair to ourselves is jumping from structure to verdict without evidence. Because once we let atmosphere replace verification, thinking stops. And when thinking stops, tone becomes truth. Volume becomes proof. Repetition becomes confirmation. That's dangerous, not because people shouldn't question power, but because questioning power requires clarity, not just intensity. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes what feels explosive is actually structural. Media rewards tension. Elite circles are dense and insulated. Public trust is low. Those three realities alone can create an emotional firestorm, even if the underlying facts are still limited. That doesn't mean nothing matters. It means scale can get distorted, and distortion doesn't help anyone. Not the public, not accountability, not truth. So where do we actually stand? Right now, we know an interview reportedly existed. We know it resurfaced. We know the association triggered strong reaction. Everything beyond that requires evidence. Not implication, not symbolism. Evidence. And until that evidence exists in full context, the most disciplined position isn't outrage or dismissal, it's awareness. Awareness that power psychology is real, media amplification is real, elite proximity is real, public distrust is real. But none of those automatically equal a hidden master plan. We don't deny tension, we control it, we don't dismiss suspicion, we test it, we don't let symbolic weight substitute for proof. Because once symbolic weight becomes verdict, we've replaced analysis with atmosphere. And atmosphere is easy to manipulate. So we stay steady, we ask better questions, we wait for context, and we refuse to let speed dictate our conclusions. That's not passive, that's disciplined. And in a system built on acceleration, discipline is rare. That's where I land. Not with certainty, not with drama, but with control.
And that's Michekyakeymi.